Amy Winehouse was only 20 years old when the world first heard her voice. But she didn't sound 20. She sounded like she had lived through decades of heartbreak, like a forgotten jazz singer pulled from an old record and dropped into modern London. People called her voice raw, timeless, impossible to imitate. But here's the strange part. The Amy Winehouse voice everyone remembers wasn't always there. Listen closely to her earliest recordings and you'll hear something different. The accent changes, the phrasing changes, even the texture of her voice begins to transform. So where did that voice actually come from? Was it natural talent, careful imitation, the producers surrounding her, or something much more personal? Because Amy Winehouse didn't simply discover one of the most recognizable voices in music. She built it. And hidden inside that voice is the story of how a young singer became trapped inside the sound that made her famous. Start at the beginning. Southgate, North London, 1983. A household where the record player runs more than the television. Her father favors Frank Sinatra and the American Songbook. Her grandmother, Cynthia, once sang jazz clubs herself, moving in the same circles as serious London jazz musicians. By the time Amy is old enough to sing along, she's not picking up a hobby. She's absorbing a language. At Sylvia Young Theatre School, she trains for musical theater, not jazz. But outside class, she is building her own curriculum. Sarah Vaughan, Dinah Washington, Thelonious Monk, singers and players who bend a note instead of hitting it, who let a line drift behind the beat like it's being invented in real time. This is not a teenager quoting influences for an interview. This is training. Listen to what actually happens technically. Where a pop vocalist hits a note directly, Amy slides into it from below, a technique borrowed straight from horn players and bebop singers. She holds consonants loosely and vowels long, stretching a single syllable across half a bar the way Sarah Vaughan does on a slow ballad. Her vibrato is narrow and controlled, not wide and theatrical, closer to a jazz singer's restraint than a pop belter's flourish. None of this happens by accident. It happens because she spends years deliberately rebuilding her instrument around a vocabulary that predates her by 4 decades. Which brings us back to the question. Because talent alone does not explain what happens next. In 2003, she releases her debut album, Frank. The title alone tells you where her head is. Produced largely with Salaam Remi, it leans into jazz and neo-soul, and it works. It sells well in the UK, and critics take her seriously. But listen to Frank next to what comes after, and something is missing. The voice is close. It is not yet complete. Frank is proof of concept. It is not yet the sound the whole world will know her by. That sound needed one more ingredient, and it wasn't Amy's alone. In 2006, she starts work on her second album with producer Mark Ronson. Ronson has an idea that goes past writing songs in an old style. He wants to record the way records were made in the early 1960s, using the actual method, not just the mood. Sessions happen largely at Daptone Records in Brooklyn, home to a group of musicians who spend their careers recreating vintage soul and funk without irony. That band becomes the Dap Kings. Vintage microphones, analog tape, a live band playing together in a room, not a song built piece by piece on a screen. Here's why that detail matters more than it sounds like it should. A digital imitation of a 1960s girl group record sounds like an imitation. A band actually recording that way, on the equipment those original records were made on, sounds like the real thing. Because technically, it is the real thing. The album's most famous song starts almost by accident. Amy's management suggests she check into a rehab program to address her drinking. She refuses, and later recounts the exchange, almost word for word, to Ronson in the studio. He tells her that's the song. Within minutes, they sketch out the chorus. It becomes Rehab, built on a real conversation, not an invented lyric, and it becomes the song most responsible for introducing her sound to an American audience that had never heard of her. Layer onto that the specific sound Ronson and Winehouse keep circling back to. The girl groups of the early 1960s, the Shangri-Las, the lush, orchestrated soul coming out of Motown. That sound runs on one formula. A young woman narrating her own romantic disaster with surprising composure over a string and horn arrangement built for heartbreak. Amy doesn't need to reach for that formula. At the exact time she's writing these songs, her relationship with Blake Fielder Civil is collapsing. The lyrics on Back to Black are pulled directly from that collapse. The 1960s arrangement style and the emotional content she is actually living turn out to fit together with unsettling precision. The girl group sound was always heartbreak delivered with composure. Amy has both, and she isn't performing either one. The album lands in October 2006. It doesn't sound retro in the way that word usually implies, a knowing wink at the past. It sounds inevitable. Like this exact combination, a jazz-trained voice, a resurrected production method, and heartbreak that's actually real, had simply been waiting for someone to assemble it correctly. Back to Black sells tens of millions of copies worldwide. At the 2008 Grammy Awards, Amy wins 5, tying the record at the time for the most Grammys ever won by a British female artist in one night. The sound doesn't stay contained to the record. Amy's visual image becomes an extension of it. The towering beehive, the thick black eyeliner, the pin-up silhouette, all deliberately styled to evoke the exact era her voice was borrowing from. It isn't costume for its own sake. It's the same time travel happening on stage that's already happening on tape, and it makes her instantly recognizable at a moment when pop stars are otherwise trending toward interchangeable. So here's the part that gets left out of most retellings. That voice was not an accident of raw talent. It was a deliberate act of musical archaeology carried out by people who knew exactly which decades-old techniques to revive and why they would still work on a modern audience. Amy supplied the voice, the writing, and the raw material of her own life. Ronson and the Daptone musicians supplied the technical means to make a 2006 record sound like it had been pulled straight from 1963. Neither piece works without the other, which is where the story turns. Because the voice that made Amy Winehouse famous also became the voice the world expected every time she stepped on stage. The persona she built calcified into something she couldn't set down. In the years that follow, a wave of British artists, Duffy, Adele, and others, arrive riding the same retro soul revival Back to Black helped ignite, turning what began as one singer's personal archaeology into a commercial genre of its own. The years after Back to Black bring intense fame, intense scrutiny, and a public struggle with addiction, playing out largely in front of cameras. On July 23, 2011, Amy Winehouse dies at 27, joining a small, grim list of major musicians who died at that exact age. So, was it natural talent, careful imitation, or the producers around her? The honest answer is all three, welded together so tightly that even Amy herself may not have been able to separate them by the end. Her grandmother's record collection, her own obsessive study of singers 3 generations older than she was, a producer willing to rebuild a 1960s recording process from the ground up. All of it converged in one voice, at one moment, and the public could never quite tell where the homage ended and the original talent began. She didn't discover that voice. She built it, note by note, record by record, and in the end, she never quite figured out how to live outside it. In the years since her death, that voice has only grown harder to escape. Artists who came up idolizing her still cite Back to Black as the record that gave them permission to sound old before their time. Session musicians who played with her describe an artist who never once faked the emotion behind a lyric, who treated a jazz standard from decades earlier with the same seriousness as a song she'd written about her own life the week before. That's the part the tabloid version of her story leaves out. The tragedy was real, but so was the craft underneath it, built deliberately, studied obsessively, and delivered with a level of control most singers spend a lifetime chasing and never fully catch. Amy Winehouse spent her whole career sounding like she'd stepped out of another era. In the end, she may be the reason that era never fully left.